Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Yeager. Are you ready to begin the scholarly portion of your DNP journey? Before we get started, if you have not yet printed off the DNP manuscript template from the DNP Lounge, stop what you're doing right now and get that template into your hands. The template is your guide to the project manuscript process, and it details everything you will be including in your manuscript. All right, let's jump right in and begin discussing Chapter 1. Just like the first chapter of any book or any paper, this chapter is laid out in such a way as to provide the space to create the foundation for your project manuscript. As you are developing the sections of this chapter, you always want to keep your reader in mind. Imagine your reader is a high school student with no medical knowledge and no general worldly knowledge at all. Therefore, when you are describing your target problem, you need to assume that your reader does not have medical or nursing knowledge. For instance, don't begin discussing, say, diabetes as if you are speaking to a room full of nurses. You want to provide a nice description of diabetes and how it impacts patients. Got it? Okay, let's move on. Here we go. The first section of Chapter 1 will, of course, include an introduction. However, you do not want to add an introduction heading of any kind. Just start with your first paragraph. Now, you want to think of your introduction as your opportunity to make that first impression on your reader. You only get one chance to make a first impression, right? Therefore, you want to use this space to grab the reader's attention and create immediate interest in your problem. Think about throwing in some powerful statements here that will put your reader on the edge of their seat. Now that you have captured your reader's attention, wrap up your intro paragraph with a sentence that briefly states what your project will accomplish, and that sentence will serve as a smooth transition for the reader into the next section of the chapter. Now that you have piqued your reader's interest with your captivating introduction, it is time to get into the real meat of your topic of interest. You are building the foundation for your project by painting a picture of the problem you want to target, so you can't skimp here. This section needs to be robust and describe all the nooks and crannies of your problem. You could also think of this section as the time to provide evidence that your problem exists and that it is a significant problem that is begging to be addressed. Another way to view this background section is that it also details the current state of the problem. You need to sell your problem hard so that your reader comes away from this section feeling strongly attached to this problem. In order to make this sell, you need to load this section up with evidence from the literature. QI projects are all about implementing evidence-based strategies to improve patient outcomes, so making critical connections to the literature is a key feature of the DNP manuscript. Now that your reader fully understands your topic of interest, or the problem, we want to keep moving forward so we can transition the reader into a discussion of how you are going to fix this problem. But before we can discuss your proposed project, we must illustrate the impact this problem has on patients. You want to use this section to recap the nature of your problem, but we are doing so through the lens of how it impacts patients. For instance, if you are targeting diabetes, you can use this section to provide details on the potential complications of uncontrolled glucose levels, how the disease impacts other conditions, etc. This impact discussion flows easily into a follow-up discussion of the consequences of not addressing this problem. Are you starting to see how these sections build on one another? With each new section or concept, you are adding another layer of information and building a stronger foundation for your project. Now, this section should only be about a page long, so try to avoid repeating the background section and instead just pull key points from there to create this new section. At this point, you have now prepared your reader for your quality improvement project, so you will want to end this section with a sentence telling the reader how your project targets the problem in order to transition the reader to the next section. The purpose of the project. I want you to think about what you would say if someone asks you, "What is your DNP project?" How would you answer this question? You wouldn't state your PICO back to them. You wouldn't talk about your literature review. You would tell them in layman's terms what your project is, right? So the statement that you would tell that person is exactly what you will be creating and placing into this section of the chapter. Just a very straightforward description of the project itself. Speaking of the PICO, now is the time to add it to your manuscript. This section of the chapter is another very straightforward one. Put your level 1 heading in there and then provide your PICO question underneath. This section will not be a full paragraph. It is designed to highlight your PICO question. Now, when developing your PICO question, it is important to follow this framework. The answers to each of these questions will become your PICO. For instance, first question, what is your target population? Let's say you are planning a project which focuses on elderly patients. Elderly is not an objective term. Therefore, you need to be more specific in your PICO by stating that your target population is adults 65 years of age and older. See the difference? Okay, moving on. I is your intervention. What evidence-based strategy or practice change are you planning to implement? What action are you taking? Next, we have the C. C represents your comparison group. Since you are completing a quality improvement project and not a research project, your comparison is simply the current standard of care. O identifies your outcome. When you consider your outcome, you need to select something that is measurable. Thoughts, feelings, knowledge are not easily measured. Concentrate on what patient outcome you are attempting to impact with your intervention. Are you trying to lower a patient's hemoglobin H1C values? Are you trying to reduce hospital readmits? Are you trying to increase referrals? You need to identify an outcome that will provide you with measurable data that you can use to show the impact of your project. And finally, the T, your time frame. How much time will you spend collecting data on your project implementation? Typically, your timeline should be around 8 weeks. Let's move on to the next section of Chapter 1. As we discussed earlier, a DNP project is evidence-based. Part of that foundation also includes having a nursing theoretical foundation that guides your project creation. In this section, you will identify the nursing theory you have chosen as the basis for your project development. This section is designed to be 1 to 2 pages long, so this suggested length sets the expectation of depth and detail for this section. To begin, you need to state what your chosen theory is and then provide a thorough review of your chosen theory. Next, you need to illustrate how your project is guided by the principles or concepts of your chosen theory. In other words, based on your chosen theory, why should your project be successful? You will also see that the directions for this section in the DNP template state you will also need to select an EBP model for your project. You will add a paragraph describing your EBP model at the end of Chapter 2, not here in Chapter 1. Okay, now it's time to circle back to the topic of interest and/or the problem your project is targeting. You want to remind the reader what your problem is, but now we are expanding that discussion. This section is the time to really drive your point home about the significance of your problem, because now you are tossing a much wider net of impact and discussing the implications to society at large, to the global community, and also what impact might be present for the nursing profession. Other questions that can help drive this section would be, why is this project so incredibly awesome? What makes your project so unique and so perfect? Plan for this section to be about a page long. In the definition of terms section, you are not necessarily listing words that the reader doesn't know, but you are highlighting terms that you are using in a specific way when discussing your project. So it is important that the reader understands these central concepts. For instance, if you are doing a project on mindfulness meditation, one of the terms you would need to define is mindfulness, so that when you begin discussing your project in detail, the reader has a thorough understanding of the central concepts of your problem and project. Identifying potential barriers is a key step in the planning process for any project. Therefore, this section of the chapter is included to provide the space for you to demonstrate that you have considered factors that could potentially interfere with your project implementation. This next section is one where many students surprisingly fall short. Most importantly, you need to make sure you include all 9 essentials in this section. Each essential should then have 2 to 3 sentences clearly describing how your project addresses that essential. This section is the heart of the D&P journey, and you need to be able to describe in depth how your project speaks to each D&P essential. The D&P program is preparing you to take on a leadership role within the nursing profession. The foundation of all accredited D&P programs is based upon these D&P essentials. These essentials epitomize the skills and characteristics that distinguish a D&P prepared nurse. Therefore, you want to really spend time on this section and make sure you discuss each essential in depth. All right, we've reached the end of chapter 1. Yay! Now, when we talk about conclusions should never be long. You want to create a concise review of the key points discussed in the chapter. You might consider reviewing the chapter and jotting down bullet points that represent the key points from each section, and then you can filter out duplicate topics so you end up with just the main ones to include in your conclusion paragraph. Just like the introduction should be used to generate a first impression for the reader, the conclusion is your opportunity to create a lasting impression. What do you want the reader to walk away with from this chapter? How will you use this last paragraph to drive home the significance of your problem and the feasibility of your proposed solution? You also want to be mindful of how you can use this space to help transition your reader to the next chapter, which will be your literature review. I have pulled out all the headings from the D&P manuscript template for Chapter 1. You can use this list as a checklist if you want. Each heading you see in this list, you should also see in your draft of Chapter 1. All of these headings should be Level 1 headings. Guidelines for headings are provided by APA, so if you have any questions, refer to your APA resource for clarification. To finish up, I want to provide some quick reminders about general guidelines for your assignment submission. First off, this chapter should be about 3,000 to 3,750 words. If you are way over that number, you have added too much information, so you need to go back through it and edit out the fluff. If your word count is way under, then you have not addressed each of the section prompts to the appropriate depth, so you need to compare the section descriptions with your draft and identify where you are coming up short. You will be citing references throughout this chapter, so you will need to include a reference list with this submission. Keep in mind that all your references need to be published within the last 5 years in order to be included in your reference list. I know you may be feeling a little overwhelmed at this point, But the key to writing these chapters is understanding how to break them down into smaller chunks. For instance, you may not even write the intro or the conclusion until you've written the rest of the chapter. There are lots of different ways to break this up. Hopefully, though, the breakdown of this chapter 1 will help you recognize the subtle differences of the various sections. Each section has a distinct purpose. So if you feel like you are just rewriting the same thing again, refer back to the DNP manuscript template or to this presentation for clarification on the section. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me anytime. I am happy to connect with you. And just remember, you've got this.